We are the ministry of the real truth, and it was suggested us by someone in our comments that to truly know or understand what atheism is, that we should read this book, Atheism, The Case Against God by George H. Smith, from the Skeptic's Bookshelf, because they suggested this is the only book one should read on atheism, possibly to fully understand it, to know what it's all about, because definitions aren't good enough. Instead of using definitions, we should read this book. Okay, no problem there. So we decided, we actually told him we would read this book, so we're going to read this book, and we're going to do a video on it to see what it says. Okay, who was George H. Smith, first of all? George H. Smith, George Hamilton Smith, February 10, 1949 to April 8, 2022, so he died last year. Was an American author, editor, educator and speaker, known for his writings on atheism. Okay, and this is what it's defined as. Atheism in the broader sense is an absence of belief in the existence of deities, a god or any gods. Less broadly, atheism is a rejection of the belief that any deities exist. In an even narrower sense, atheism is specifically the position that there are no deities. And libertarianism, a political philosophy that upholds liberty as a core value. Libertarians seek to maximize autonomy and political freedom and minimize the state's encroachment on and violations of individual liberties, emphasizing the rule of law, pluralism, cosmopolitan, whatever that may be, whatever that continues to say. Biography. Smith grew up in Tucson, Arizona, USA, etc., etc. He secured a contract from Nash Publishing, then located in Los Angeles, to produce a book on atheism. The finished product was his first book, Atheism, The Case Against God, in 1974. Smith began teaching in the 1970s, first under the auspices of his own Forum for Philosophical Studies, with offices on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles, USA. Later under the auspices of the Cato Institute, an American libertarian think tank headquartered in Washington, D.C., USA. It was founded in 1997 by Ed Crane, Murray Rothbard, and Charles Koch, Chairman of the Board and Chief Executive Officer of Koch Industries, and so forth. And the Institute for Humane Studies, IHS, a non-profit organisation that promotes the teaching and research of classical liberalism and higher education in the United States. IHS offers funding, opportunities, programs and events for faculty and graduate students, etc. For nearly 20 years, from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s, he spent his summers teaching political philosophy, the philosophical study of government, addressing questions about the nature, scope and legitimacy of public agent and institutions, and the relationships between them. And American political and intellectual history to university students at seminars sponsored by Cato Institute and IHS. During the 1980s, Smith worked for more than 6 years as the general editor of Knowledge Products, a national-based company that produced educational audio recordings in philosophy, history, economics and current affairs. During those years, in addition to his duties as editor, Smith was also the primary scriptwriter for Knowledge Products, Great Political Thinkers series. These recordings have been used widely in college classrooms. Since 1971, more than 100 of Smith's articles and books reviews have appeared in a wide range of publications, including the New York Times, the Arizona Daily Star, Reason Magazine, Free Inquiry, The Humanist Inquiry, Cato Policy Report, Liberty, The Voluntarist, and so forth. He wrote a weekly column on libertarian and classical liberal thought for libertarianism.org, a website operated by Cato. He presented his arguments in favour of non-political participation in his party dialogue, neither bullets nor ballots, considering it a practice of power through rhetoric, even though its activity is carried out by parties in favour of freedom and justice, since every party exercises the coercive power of the state, whether it uses it or not, and always under political commitments. Mistrusting all political activity, he separated libertarianism from partisanship. A partisan is a committed member of a political party. In multi-party systems, the term is used for persons who strongly support their party's policies and are reluctant to compromise with political opponents, whereas the libertarianism is different, and so forth. Okay, that's a little bit of information on him. Okay, let's have a look at Michael Martin and his review. Michael Martin reviews Smith. Okay, editor's note: this article was originally published in Teaching Philosophy 5.2, April 1982, page 152 to 55. The page numbers below show the position of the text within that pagination scheme. That's Michael Martin, Boston University, who states, this book is a hard-hitting attack against belief in the Christian God as well as all other supernatural beings called gods in the book, intended primarily for laymen, everyday ordinary Joe, and consequently relatively free from technical philosophical argument and jargon. This book might well be used in a beginning course in the philosophy of religion as a fair representation of contemporary atheistic thought. Students would, Michael Martin believes, find it more provocative and challenging than some other treatment. They may be technically more sophisticated. The author's direct and forceful way of making his points has great appeal. Clearly it is a book written with deep intellectual passion. However, there are some limitations to the book as an introduction to atheism, and teachers of philosophy might wish to supplement it with other works. First, Smith's critical treatment of the standard arguments for the existence of God is incomplete. Variants of the cosmological and technological arguments are critically evaluated, but the ontological argument and other arguments for the existence of God are not considered. 1. And it must be a reference. Okay. Second, the argument against the existence of God from the existence of evil is by the author's own admission not treated in depth. The author believes, incorrectly Michael Martin thinks, that relative to other difficulties with belief in God, the problem of evil is not important. 80. Third, argument against the existence of God using some version of the verifiability theory of meaning are not developed at all. There is another point that should be mentioned that may, unjustifiably, Michael Martin believes, make some philosophy teachers hesitate to use the book. According to information provided on the back cover, Smith studied philosophy at the University of Arizona, but it is unclear how much formal training in philosophy he has had. He has, however, been greatly influenced by Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden. Rand and Branden are cited and quoted more frequently in the book than anyone else. And on the back cover, Smith is billed as a student of the libertarian point of view and co-editor of a libertarian periodical. However, Smith's libertarian, this is probably on page 153, views are absent from the present work, and his quotations for Rand and Branden have nothing to do with their political views. Other atheists might have been cited and quoted just as easily, atheists with completely different political views. Unfortunately, in part 1, Smith adopts some of Branden's arguments for the non-existence of God, which seem to Michael Martin to be dubious. On the other hand, in part 4, he relies on Rand's views about the science of ethics, which seem to Martin not to be dubious. In any case, these views seem neutral with respect to a libertarian position. Space does not permit Martin to evaluate critically all of Smith's interesting theses, so he decided he'd therefore discuss parts 2, 3 and 4 of the book very briefly and limit most of his critical remarks to part 1, which contains Smith's major arguments for believing that God or a God does not exist. It should be noted, however, that part 2, a critique of faith, and part 4, a critique of theological ethics, in particular the ethics of Jesus, are worthwhile and fascinating. Part 3, a critique of some traditional arguments for God, is less original and useful. In the first part of the book, Smith argues that atheism is simply the absence of theistic belief. So, from the fact that someone is an atheist, nothing can be inferred about any of his or her positive beliefs. Presumably, Nothing can be inferred either about the absence of any belief except the absence of theistic belief. In fact, throughout the book, Smith seems to use atheism in a broader sense than this. He seems to assume that atheism is the absence of any belief in any supernatural being or beings, deism, polytheism, etc. In any case, given Smith's minimal definition of atheism, agnosticism is not an alternative to atheism, since agnosticism is the denial of knowledge or of a god or gods. We always thought it was like you don't know, you don't have that information, you're not sure, because that's what. But the Ehrman said as an agnostic atheist. That's how he explained it. And we looked at the actual words in the Greek of Gnostic, gnosis, and it was to know, to have, something like that. Okay. So agnostic would be not having that knowledge, or denying that knowledge of a god or gods. You're not really sure. That's what it's defined as. You're not too sure that there is a god or not. You need to define that word and find the etymology, the origins of that word. So you won't take it out of context. You'll fully understand it, and then you won't take it out of context. Thus, one can be agnostic atheist, a person who does not have a theistic belief and who denies that knowledge of supernatural beings is possible. Well, we found through defining them, those words, agnostic and atheist, that one is not knowing, not having that knowledge, and the other is a non-belief in any god or gods, that they don't exist. In regards to those religious theists, a person who does not have a theistic belief and who denies that knowledge of supernatural beings is possible. One can also be an implicit atheist, a person, for example, a young child, who does not believe in a god or gods, but who has not explicitly rejected the belief that a god or gods exist. So that's an implicit atheist. So I guess if someone says, a child was born an atheist, I don't think so. He just doesn't know about God yet. The child hasn't declared, I don't believe in a God or any gods. Or one can be an explicit atheist, a person who has explicitly rejected belief in a god or gods, the motive for this rejection being either rational or irrational. Probably page 17. Unfortunately, later on in the book, Smith's own restrictions on the concept of atheism seem to have been forgotten. He maintains that explicit atheism is a consequence of commitment to rationality, page 98, and that an atheist does not accept the premise that the universe requires an explanation, 231. But by Smith's own admission, an explicit atheist could be irrationally motivated. And this guy Martin, this writer, saw no reason, given Smith's construal, why an atheist might not believe that the universe requires an explanation, although not one in terms of a god or gods. Although, according to the minimal definition of atheism suggested by Smith, this is suggested by Smith, an atheist does not have to believe that a god or gods do not exist. An atheist does not have to believe that a god or gods do not exist. The atheism actually defended in this book is a stronger version. Smith argues that the claim that a god or gods exist is contradictory, and that the concept of the Christian God is contradictory. Smith seems to believe, in other words, that he provides reasons for believing that a claim that God or gods exist could not be true, since, presumably, a contradictory claim could not be true, and a contradictory concept cannot refer to any existing entity. Consider first his argument, apparently based on Brandon's view, that to assert that a God exists is contradictory, page 41 to 44. First, he argues that anything that exists has a specific nature. Second, he argues that a specific nature is determined by natural law. Third, he argues that since a God by definition transcends natural law, a God does not have a specific nature. Finally, he concludes that a God cannot exist since it has not a specific nature. Consequently, to assert that a God exists is contradictory. One debatable premise in this part of the argument is surely that natural law determines an entity's specific nature. Second, he argues that it is contradictory to claim that God or gods exist and are unknowable. His argument is this: this is page 154, if a God is unknowable, it cannot be known to exist. But to assert that a God exists is to claim that this God is known to exist. This argument has problems. Surely one can assert that a God exists and yet not claim to know that a God exists. One might only claim to believe that a God exists. Further, one might claim that a God's nature is unknowable and yet claim a God's existence is knowable, except when existence of a God is included in the nature of a God. But this inclusion would mean that existence was a predicate. There is no reason to suppose that a believer in a God is necessarily committed to this dubious ontological view. To be sure, if one did claim that a God's existence is knowable and a God's nature is unknowable and indeed incomprehensible, one would have no basis for worshipping this God or attributing any moral attributes to the God. This would be an extremely serious problem for followers of religious practice connected with this God. But it is one thing to claim this and quite another thing to claim that. Asserting that a God is unknowable is contradictory. Smith's attempt to show that the concept of the Christian God is contradictory is, Martin believes, also unsuccessful on page 67-76. For example, he attempts to show that God's omnipotence is incompatible with God's action. An omnipotent being would not need to act, but the Christian God does act. He also attempts to show that God's omnipotence is incompatible with God's omniscience. If God is omnipotent, he could change the future. If God is omniscient, he could know the future. But if the future could be changed, God could not know the future. It is impossible here to evaluate these arguments in detail, but they are surely not obviously valid. Consider the first argument. To say that a being is omnipotent is to say that it could do anything that is logically possible. But it does not obviously follow that if God could do anything, then he would. So if God did not need to act because he is omnipotent, it does not mean that he would not act. So omnipotence and action are not clearly logically incompatible, as Smith seems to argue. The argument proposing to show the incompatibility of omnipotence and omniscience is not obviously valid either. First of all, it is not clear in what sense it is logically possible to change the future. So if God could not change the future, this would hardly be a limitation of his power. But even if it was logically possible in some sense to change the future, it is unclear why this would mean that God could not know the future. Suppose that it is possible to change the future by some action A. Suppose that this means merely that if action A were to be done now, some true proposition P about the future would be false and action A could be done now. Clearly, Martin could know a certain proposition about the future, for example, that he will be alive 1 minute from now, and yet it is possible that he could change the future in the above sense by an act of suicide. If this is possible for a mere mortal, it is certainly possible for God. The upshot, the writer believes, is that Smith is not successful in showing that the concept of a Christian God is contradictory. Unfortunately, Smith does not attempt to argue on inductive grounds that the existence of God is improbable. His arguments are basically a priori. But as Martin has argued elsewhere, and a posteriori approach, for example, in relation to the problem of evil, is a fruitful one for an atheist to take. Although Smith does briefly consider the problem of evil, series 6 to 87, pages 76 to 87, he ends up arguing only that the problem drives Christians to agnosticism and blind faith. He does not argue, as Martin believes he should, that the existence of evil makes the existence of God improbable. Smith is wise enough not to claim that the existence of evil contradicts the idea that an all-good, all-powerful God exists. In the second part of the book, Smith contrasts faith and reason and criticizes faith. He argues that faith is based on a deep-seated irrationalism, which in turn is based on an unwarranted skepticism. He rejects skepticism using familiar arguments. Skepticism is self-refuting. For example, The skeptic claims to know we can. Page 155. The skeptic claims to know we cannot know anything. Doubt is always contextual. Universal doubt makes no sense, and skeptics use concepts that have no right to use given their skepticism. He critically evaluates various concepts of faith and appeals to Christian revelation. Unfortunately, in the process, Smith seems to embrace uncritically both the view that logical principles are self-evident and some form of direct realism in the philosophy of perception, of 59. In the third part of the book, Smith argues against certain variants of the cosmological and teleological arguments. Smith's criticisms are fairly standard and should be well known to readers of this journal. In the fourth part of the book, Smith attacks religious ethics and contrasts it with what he calls a science of ethics. Ethics as a science guides man's choice relative to certain human ends, such as survival or happiness. Ethics so conceived is a rational enterprise. Certain actions are conducive to survival or happiness. Certain actions are not. This can be established by evidence and argument. Ethics construed in this way establishes statements of instrumental value, not intrinsic value. Smith does not attempt to deal with the more difficult questions of what ultimate goals humans should pursue, question of intrinsic value, but simply posits happiness as man's ultimate ethical goal. Page 286. Religious ethics, on the other hand, is based on uncritical acceptance of authority and sanction, fear of punishment in the afterlife, or the psychological sanction of sin. Page 300. As a result, religious ethics is not conducive to human happiness, and in fact encourages guilt, passivity, and a feeling of helplessness. 310, page 310. These psychological claims about the results of religious beliefs need psychological evidence to support them. Unfortunately, Smith does not supply this evidence. Perhaps the least philosophical but most devastating section of the book for modern Christianity is Smith's analysis of the ethics of Jesus. By citing passages from the New Testament, Smith shows that the ethical views of Jesus are rather different from what liberal Christians like to believe. Jesus is shown as demanding unquestioning obedience, and that all worldly pursuits be forsaken. His doctrines are filled with threats of divine punishment. He demands that reason and independent judgment be forsaken. His views are very sectarian. He came to save the Jews, not the world. Well, they were the chosen people, weren't they? God's chosen. They were supposed to be the holy nation that all knowledge of God would come through, and then they're supposed to eventually teach it, or maybe go up and teach the non-Jews, accept non-Jews in their circle, so they too could know the truths about God, the God that they worship, etc., etc. But they rejected Christ when he came, God in flesh, God incarnate. They rejected him. They said, no, you're not the Messiah. No, you're not the Son of God. No, you're blasphemy. And they're looking through their scriptures. By that time, they had been mistranslated or rewritten incorrectly, all this sort of stuff. So that's why they didn't see him in the scriptures, supposedly. And they, when the ages ended, there was 0, and it's supposed to go. It was 0, then it goes to 1 BC or something like that, right? Goes from 1 BC. It goes from 0 to 1 BC, while they just went 0 BC, right? Which should have been 1. So that's supposedly that's what put them out as well. Just what we found through personal research. Okay, the Golden Rule. Okay. Furthermore, Smith argues there is nothing original in Jesus' ethical teaching. The Golden Rule, for example, was found in Confucianism 500 years earlier. And what was the Golden Rule? So look at that. Golden Rule. Just to clear that up. Golden Rule. What was the Golden Rule? Okay. What was the Golden Rule? Okay. The Golden Rule, the most familiar version of the Golden Rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Moral philosophy has barely taken notice of the Golden Rule in its own terms, etc., etc. Confucianism believes in ancestor worship and human-centered virtues. So it's all man-based. For living a peaceful life. The Golden Rule of Confucianism is do not do unto others what you would not want others to do unto you. There's a debate over if Confucianism is a religion, etc., etc. So if it's 500 years before Jesus said it, could it possibly be 1,000 years or so before when the Egyptians said it? Or could it be 1,000 years before the Egyptians said it with the Mesopotamians? Or could it be 1,000 years before the Mesopotamians with the Akkadians or the Babylonians or the Sumerians or whoever? Okay. You could say, where did that saying originally come from? Just basic common sense and logic type of rule, right? If you're going to steal from somebody else, somebody's going to steal from you. Pretty common sense, logic and common sense. Okay, can I go back to Michael Martin. All in all, Smith's book provides a lively introduction to atheism. Although professional philosophers will no doubt find fault with many of Smith's arguments, his critical attack should challenge our students and awaken them from their dogmatic slumbers. Okay. Here's some notes.